Hello, I'm Eric Matisik, co-chair of Denver Startup Week. Last year, we were able to bring the global audience together for Denver Startup Week, and this year, we're excited to welcome that global audience back as we celebrate and showcase the best of entrepreneurship that the Denver ecosystem in Colorado has to offer, in Denver and beyond. There are lots to explore this week, but most importantly, we're excited that you're joining us. We have nearly 50 sponsor companies who contribute to make Denver Startup Week possible. Let's show our love for these companies today and all week long. Thanks to our headquarters and title sponsor, Amazon, and our title sponsors whose leadership makes this week come to life, Capital One Cafe, the Downtown Denver Partnership, Fluid Truck, Hotel Engine, and WeWork, and our track sponsors who've made all the great content you're hearing today possible, which includes our founder track sponsor, Kickstart, our growth track sponsor, Friday Health Plans, developer track sponsor, Quizlet, product track sponsor, Palantir, design track sponsor, Battery 621 and the Public Works, people track sponsor, Exactly, and the spotlight event sponsor, Strat Labs. Our headline event sponsors are bringing this excitement to the entire week. Thank you to B-Side Fund, Colorado Public Radio, Comcast, Coors Brewing Company, Denver Pavilions, Entrepreneurship at the University of Denver, Gusto, JP Morgan Chase, Method, Moss Adams, Pi Insurance, Promontory Mortgage Path, Red Bull Basement, Southwest, Tattered Cover, and the VF Venture Foundry. Finally, thank you to our sponsors and member sponsors who are listed on the screen, and thank you for your support of Denver Startup Week. Now, let's get to it.
Hello, Denver. We are so excited to be here. We're excited to tell you a bit more about the Foundry for Builders program and to be a part of the Denver startup ecosystem. We moved our headquarters to Denver in the last year, and we're excited to call Denver home. Foundry for Builders, essentially we're offering our end-to-end Foundry solution that is deployed to major governments and enterprises worldwide, to early and growth stage companies so that they can build their business on Foundry from day one.
Hi everyone, welcome to Denver Startup Week. My name is Ryan Margolis and I'm the Product Track Chair and member of the Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee. Thank you for joining us for the 10th anniversary of Denver Startup Week. At DSW, we strive to make all of our sessions a space where attendees can connect, learn, and grow, regardless of age, gender identity, gender expression, race, ability, or sexual orientation. A special thank you to our sponsors for their support in helping us to keep DSW free and accessible for all. Thank you for joining us. Have a great week.
Hey everyone, it's about to get started. All right, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Morgan Monzingo. I'm a software consultant at Credera, and I'll be presenting alongside my colleague, Levi Fuller. Levi was unfortunately unable to make it today, so we have pre-recorded the session, but I'll be available to answer any questions in the Q&A or in the chat during and afterwards. The two of us have built this product development playbook based on our own experiences we've had both leading software projects, and honestly through trial and error. One note is that this is an opinionated guide to product development. This is not the only way to successfully build or deliver a project, but we hope to provide you with the tools to make your life a little bit easier. So we hope you have a deeper understanding of the processes that we use to understand the problem, build a feature list, translate into a roadmap, and manage stakeholders and your developers. I'm going to post some product development terms that we use within the presentation in the Zoom chat, so please feel free to reference them there. I hope that you enjoy.
All right, let's get started. For today's presentation, we're going to walk through our own project planning activities given a scenario. You were just hired on as a product manager at a company named Chipper. Chipper sells recycled clothing and is looking to break into the online market with an e-commerce site. The question we want to answer is, how do we get from an idea to an e-commerce site? So let's start off with understanding the project a little bit better.
The best way to understand the project is by having a conversation with the stakeholders at Chipper. We want to understand what they're trying to accomplish, why they want to create an e-commerce platform, and also understand some of the project constraints that we'll be factoring into our project plan. So the first question we ask is, what are we hoping to accomplish? And Chipper told us, we're trying to build an e-commerce site to sell recycled clothing for under 150K. The fact that they mentioned the budget, along with telling you that they want to build the e-commerce site, should be an indicator that this is very important to them. The next question we might ask is, why do we want to build an e-commerce site? The stakeholders said, currently, we only ship our clothing to physical stores, and our customers frequently complain that they can't browse or purchase clothing online. We want to maximize sales of our most popular clothing, which are jeans and jackets. So now we know that the main goal is to enable customers to browse and purchase clothing online. Next, we would ask, what do we have in place so far? Trying to get an understanding of what they've already built, and where they are at in the process of delivering and building this product. So Chipper's told us we have the initial requirements and we have some wireframes used as a reference. We also have a custom inventory management system that the application will need to integrate with. So now we've gained one of the requirements and we understand that we are past the initiation phase of this project and starting to get into planning. They know what they want to build, they have an idea, and now it's up to us to plan that project and deliver on it. Next, we could ask, when do you want to go live? And they told us, we sell the most clothes over New Year's, so we must go live before Christmas. And last, we would ask, how many full-time developers are available to help build it, to get a sense of the number of resources we need. We expect to have a business analyst, a UX designer, a tech lead, and 2 developers available to start. Please put together a project plan with those constraints in mind. So Chipper's established that the product must be delivered to the end users before Christmas under a budget of 150K. The scope still needs to be determined by estimating the requested features. And so below, you will see an example of the iron triangle. The basic idea of the iron triangle is that as you exceed any of the constraints, scope, cost, or time, then quality will be the main aspect of the application or the project that will suffer. So what that means is, if you try to deliver more features than you actually have the ability to, then the only way you're going to be able to do that and get it delivered on time and under budget is going to be to sacrifice some of the quality in those features. However, you can increase the quality by adjusting some of the other constraints. So let's see what those constraints look like and how they factor into the others. So first, we can look at scope. So the plan scope is going to be determined by collaborating with the product owner, who will be a member of the stakeholders, to translate the product requirements into a feature list and then estimate it. So items can only be added to scope if the cost is increased or the timeline is extended to accommodate extra development, or if we want to reduce quality. But for us, we don't believe that should be a factor. We want to avoid reducing quality at all costs. Next is the cost. So the cost is the sum of all resources, the team members on the team. So that would be including their salary and any benefits that they get. And also the total budget that the team has allocated towards development. So that may be things such as third-party tools, paying for cloud infrastructure, or any of those other considerations. Typically, costs can only be reduced if we remove items from the scope and reduce the timeline, or also reduce quality, but that's something we want to avoid. Last, we have time. The timeline will include the targeted delivery date and any other externally required deadlines. For example, they might want final approval on the product 1 month ahead of time, which would mean that development needs to be completed a month ahead of time. And also any user acceptance testing dates and other considerations that might affect the timeline. Typically, the timeline can only be reduced if we increase the number of resources or we reduce the scope or also quality. But again, we want to avoid reducing quality and keep it at its maximum at all costs.
Okay, now that you know the project constraints, it's time to start working on your feature list. I like to bring my feature list to every meeting at the very beginning of a project. And on the left, you'll see all of the headers that I use to make up this feature list. So I always start with an epic. What are the high-level flows that make up the application? So when you think of e-commerce, I think of view product, manage cart, checkout, manage orders, items like that. And then I'll break those epics down into smaller pieces, and those will be the features. So for view products, that might be browsing a product page, but it also could be clicking on an image and seeing product details. For each of the features, I'll add in a description, and those descriptions are unique to the user's actions. For browsing a product page, why do we want to do that? Because it allows users to browse all of our available products. And so coming up with these user-centric descriptions actually helps the product identify what's the most important functionality for this application. Next, I'll work on my developer activities. And that's something that if you are technical, it's easy for you to do. But if you're not, sometimes you need to bring in your tech team as well. And so my activities are, what are all the individual steps that need to happen to make up the feature? So for viewing the product page, I need to create a view. I need an endpoint that gets all of the products. I need that to be set as the home page, or the user has to be able to click each image to pull up a product page. Those are some of the descriptions or activities for the tech team that I would add in. Next, I track all of my open questions, and no open question is too big or small. So I might start out with some of the large questions like, are we using a third-party payment system? And I might move into further down the road, should this button be brown? Should we match some other functionality? Can we use libraries from other teams? Things like that. Then I have my dependencies, and those are all dependent tasks that have to be completed before we start the feature. This might seem silly or like it's too much work, but this really helps when you're building out your roadmap in the future. And last, we have our estimate. And I do have an entire slide dedicated to estimate, so I'll just talk really quickly. That's just your level of effort. Some people use t-shirt sizes, so small, medium, large. Some people like hours. I like to use story points, but we'll get into that later. Okay, so I talked through how I build out my feature list as an Excel sheet, but how do you actually fill it out? So I start by interviewing all stakeholders so that I can understand the requirements that they're expecting for this application. Ask them questions, try to dig into what's important with this application. They may not be able to list everything perfectly, so it's your job to dig it out. Then I'll actually collaborate with the developers. Sometimes there are tasks that your product owners don't think of, and so you need to go to your developers to talk through those non-functional requirements and anything that might be missing. It's better to have more brains than one iterating on a feature list. And then after you have all of these meetings, you translate the requirements into your feature list. And honestly, it's pretty iterative. So as I have meetings, I'll update my feature list, and then I'll talk to my developers. I'll update it again. I might go back to the stakeholders. It's a whole process. One thing we do want to note is that we like to use thin vertical slices of functionality. And what that means to us is end-to-end functionality that a single user could test. So I wouldn't just have a feature that is a page that doesn't, like when I click things, nothing works, but instead I would have a page that I click a button and something is saved in the database, or it pulls from an endpoint, something like that. Okay, so once you have your feature list built out, you're going to need to start prioritizing. A good rule of thumb is that your highest priority should always be the most critical flow. So when thinking through Chipper's use case, they want users to come into their store, purchase recycled clothing, and be able to check out and receive a receipt. So anything that adds to that flow is something that should be a priority level 1. So if you look over here, we need provisioning the application infrastructure and application setup to be highest priority because we can't add any other functionality. If managed cart was on this list as well, that's something I'd probably add as a priority 1 or checkout. Priority 2 are features that will greatly enhance the user's experience, but they're not necessarily required. So one of the ideas for priority 2 for us is user authentication. Technically speaking, we can do a guest, and if we need to, maybe we need to drop user authentication. Now, if you think through it, guest checkout can have its flaws as well. Like, what if a user wants to log into an account and see their previous orders? We're going to miss out on all that because of the guest checkout functionality. But is it really that critical to allow users to pay for clothing? And then third is features that are nice to have, but they're not critical to the most important application, or it's pretty simple, like a UI UX change. So an example for this would be the administration inventory. And so we're thinking that technically the back office could just run a SQL script and we wouldn't need to build a whole portal for them to come and add in new clothing. Now, that could be really annoying for the back office, but the user's not going to experience it. They're just going to see the clothes in the store. So it might be something that needs to be a 3 or can be cut. Another thought is, what if all the buttons are brown, but we want to change our company colors to blue? I think that's a lower priority because we really need to focus on getting that cart out to the customers. That's how I prioritize my feature list. And I do this pretty early on. And I always talk with my stakeholders to determine whether or not my priority is correct. So next, I actually like to go in and assign estimates to each of my features on the list. I first start out with aligning on my estimation plan. What kind of estimates are we using? Are we going t-shirt size, small, medium, large? Or are we going to do story points? So I added over here what Levi and I have actually agreed on for this project. 1 story point is going to be half a day of work, and 8 story points is going to be 1 week of work. And this is for 1 person. The reason why it's not 1 story point and 10 is because we want to take into account lost time by meetings, planning, or blockers. So after Levi and I have agreed on that, we're actually going to define our development activities, which, as you know, we've already been doing that with our conversations with our tech team. So just check that off and move right on. The third thing is we're going to refine each feature's activities with the stakeholders. So after you have your feature list, it's prioritized correctly, you're going to take it back to every stakeholder and just make sure that all of your open questions and assumptions are valid or answered. And then lastly, we're going to estimate the effort to design, implement, test, and validate each feature in every environment. Some people will recommend that you just estimate based on implementation, but I have found that you will miss most of your deadlines if you do this. So have your tech team help out to identify what is it actually going to take to test the code or to validate the code in all of the environments given the company's processes.
By this time, you have estimated all of your feature items and prioritized them. So the next step is to translate those features into a roadmap. So a roadmap is used to plan the timeline for deliverables and key milestones that will help stakeholders at Chipper understand what will be completed by when. So this helps visualize the max capacity and the max concurrent work streams based on the planned development team. So in our case, we're going to have 2 full-time developers and 1 tech lead. And a tech lead should typically be at a reduced capacity. In our case, we're going to assume that they would be at a 4. And so if we take a look at this roadmap with those 3 developers, our goal is to not exceed more than 3 work streams at any one time. Next, this sets expectations with the stakeholders because they know when every single work stream or epic is planned to be delivered, and they would also know when they are expected to be completed. So this helps keep us honest about when we began the work and when we completed the work, and it allows us to make adjustments as any of those things may change. It can also be used to visually change priorities of the deliverables to understand the effect on others. So you can see if we have a max capacity for a given sprint, if we were to go and change priorities and switch some of the items around, then we could be able to do that and also see how many work streams that may affect and what that may do to the overall roadmap, either pushing other features behind and potentially pushing back the end date. Additionally, we could also use the roadmap to track refinement and design activities such as deliverables for user experience mockups and architecture design records that need to be developed and used to plan more complex features. And we will see that a little bit later as we get into our status deck and what that might look like. But for now, we're just going to be focused on the roadmap and the features. And now we're ready to assemble the roadmap. So to translate an epic to a roadmap deliverable, we have to sum the estimates for each epic and then size the deliverable on the roadmap based on the planned number of weeks completed. So in this example, we can see that we have 18 points for the application setup epic. That includes 2 features, 1 for scaffolding the apps and 1 for setting up the template, navigation, routing, those sorts of things. And so 18 points in our book is about over a week worth of effort, roughly 3 weeks of effort for a single developer. So let's take a look at this. We see our application setup in here. we can see the number of points that that total epic is worth, in our case 18, and also the planned number of developers that we would be assigning to that single work stream. So the way we calculate the weeks complete is to take the epic points, right, which is 18, and divide that by the weekly developer velocity. So if we were assigning a single developer to that, it could be 18 points divided by 8, which would be their weekly velocity, and it would take them approximately 2.25 weeks to complete. However, we know that we have some future items on the roadmap that also need to be completed, and this particular effort is a dependency that preventing us from getting started on some of the other ones. So in this particular case, we decided we want to have more than one developer on this work stream. So in our case, we would take the full-time dev and the tech lead, who's going to be at a half capacity. So that's 18 points divided by the 12 points, and that will give us about 1.5 weeks. And so typically, if an epic is going to take a partial week, we're going to go ahead and round up. We don't want to overextend ourselves on some of these items. So now that you have all of the items sized on the roadmap, we can begin playing a game that I like to call Gantt Tetris. And so we're going to use Gantt Tetris to organize each feature on the roadmap while factoring in their dependencies, priorities, and the size for each requested feature to understand what can be completed by when. So if you take a look at their epic list, we have the priority for each epic, as well as the total story points for all of the features underneath each epic. And so that's going to bring us to a total of 200 story points that they would request that we complete by the end of this project. However, there are some rules that are in place. So the first one is our development resources. Based on our current estimates, we only expect to be able to complete up to 40 points per sprint. And in our case, a sprint is going to be 2 weeks. So that means that about 20 points worth of work per week. And that's 2 devs at 8 points a week and 1 tech lead at 4 points per week. Now, you should also strive not to plan more features in parallel than you have developers available. This is going to prevent you from overextending your team. Next, you also can reduce the feature durations as necessary by planning for additional developers. So you can see in some of these cases, we've added additional developers and only had 2 epics being worked at once in order to reduce the amount of time it's going to take to get those features completed. Next, you want to make sure that you're also including at least a week of planning and at least a week of post-production support. You're never going to have a project that you can get on and start hitting the ground right away. Additionally, as soon as you go live, there's going to inevitably be bugs and issues that you need to reconcile for the production users to make sure that they have a good experience. And last, we also need to make sure that the deliverables are completed by 12/13 to accommodate the planned UAT sessions. So if we take a look at here, we have our total story points for every single sprint calculated at the bottom. And so the way that we calculated those, we'll take a look at sprint 3 just to see how that works in place. So to calculate this number, for every single epic, you're going to get the epic sprint, you're going to calculate the epic sprint points, that is the number of points for a particular epic that are factored into a particular sprint, by taking the total epic points. In this case, for inventory management, we can see that's 21. We divide that by the weeks to complete. In this case, we've stretched it 3 weeks. And so that brings us to 7. And now we multiply that by the number of weeks that are in a particular sprint. So in our case, only 1 of these weeks. So that's going to get us 7. We do the same thing for the view products and the checkout process because we have work streams that related to those epics that we are planning to work on in sprint 3. And so that's going to get us a total of 38 points for this sprint. So now that we have the initial roadmap put together, factoring all of the dependencies and priorities of the items that need to be delivered, we need to begin factoring in the team costs and their weekly velocity. So for each resource, we need to determine the team cost and the velocity for the planned 12-week duration to ensure the estimated scope does not exceed the budget and that the total velocity at least exceeds the total scope. So if we take a look at here, we've got several team members. The only ones who are actually going to be contributing to the weekly velocity will be our developer resources. And so the total weekly velocity for them is going to be 20 points, story points per week, and their weekly cost is going to be $12,400. So that brings us to a total cost of $148,800, which is just under our max budget of $150K. We also have our total velocity, which is 9 weeks because we're not going to be doing development for the first or the last 2 weeks of the project, is going to be 180 story points. And so now we understand that the requested scope is 200 points, but the team can only complete 180 before the UAT session begins. If you note from the other slide, that was on 12:10. And that means that we have about 20 points worth of scope that we need to remove to maintain quality. So now that we know that we have 20 points that we are not going to be able to complete based on our team's current capacity and some of the constraints that we have in place, we need to recommend a path forward and include all of the available options to the stakeholders. So we can start this conversation with, given the project constraints, we will not be able to accomplish all the requested scope on time. And the stakeholders respond with, that's unfortunate. What are our options? So we could tell them, we recommend either cutting scope or increasing the budget to deliver the final features after the go live. Additionally, we could add more resources to the team to increase velocity and deliver those features before the go live. And so the stakeholders tell us, we're already stretching our budget and can't push back the go live date without losing significant revenue. What can we cut from the scope and still stay under budget and still meet our deadline? So we would go into the roadmap, look at those items that are the lowest or in our feature list. And we've identified the 3 lowest priority items are order management, user authentication, and inventory management. Removing 2 of those features will allow us to hit the go live date. And the stakeholders say, I think we can survive by adding new products directly in the database for now and adding user accounts later, but we cannot support an influx of customer phone calls. Let's plan to keep order management in scope and cut inventory administration and user authentication for now. And so we say, great, we will update our product roadmap with those scope items removed. If we have excess capacity, what features should we prioritize first? We should always be thinking about what can we be doing next, right? And so just because they're deprioritizing it now doesn't mean that that might change later. And so the stakeholders say, let's prioritize user authentication next. Soon, we want to be able to add a loyalty rewards feature. So now we can go back and update our roadmap. You can see in here, we've called out that the user authentication and administer inventory features have been removed from the scope. So those are no longer going to appear in our future roadmap. We want to remove any descoped features as soon as the decision is finalized. And in this case, the stakeholders directly told us that it should not be in scope anymore. We also need to be sure to adjust any future work streams to begin earlier if the requested changes create more capacity. And if new features are added and prioritized, you must inform and discuss with the stakeholders to understand which future work streams will be affected by the decision so that they can understand what the trade-offs are. In our particular case, we can remove the requested scope item without affecting other deliverables in the roadmap because there are no deliverables after these.
Okay, so you have a feature list and you have a project plan, which is great. So now we need to get to the day tasks, which require building out a backlog. So I like to take every feature that I have and break it into smaller user stories one more time. So these user stories are going to be end-to-end activities as well for your developers to complete. So some examples we have here for the feature pay for cart are customer can specify your credit card information, or a customer can specify shipping information. All of these user stories are required for that feature to be marked complete. So I'll actually take that and I'll do that for each of my individual features in my feature list if I want, or within the preferred technology like Azure or Trello. So after we have that, we're going to go in and actually update each of the tickets to the best ability that we can. So I have here on the screen in the middle a user story that I've created, and this is for customer can pay for cart and receive an email receipt. I like to tentatively assign all of my tasks that might be pulled in for the current sprint, and that's just so I can gauge how much work each individual has assigned to them. I also add in the original estimated points, but I have the whole team re-estimate before we start implementing the story. Then I'll have that clear description that before. This is not just the user description that we saw in the feature list, but this is more about what functionality is being implemented so that whoever picks up this ticket doesn't need to come to you to ask, why is this needed? Where are the details? Things like that. Then we have our user story. And so this is a very common, as a customer, I want to do some action so that the result. And some people will like to do user stories from the idea of the product owner, just so that it can help with priority with planning. But I like to focus user stories on the why does this matter from a customer perspective. And so as a customer, I want to purchase clothing and receive a receipt so that I'm able to pay for my purchase in a secure manner and understand what I purchased after the fact. Next, I track any open questions that the individual taking the task will need to review. Sometimes these open questions are things that you as a product manager will need to figure out. I would just recommend that you communicate with your team if there's any open questions that are going to block them from taking this ticket on. We have test cases that are required for the ticket to be considered complete, assumptions that we might still be using, and then last, outlining the individual tasks that will be required to complete the ticket. And my personal opinion is that the tasks should be added in as the developer is picking up the ticket, because they might think of tasks in a different way. And so I use that as my to-do list. So we finally have a backlog, and I think we're ready to start development. One of the most difficult things, in my opinion, for a project manager is that you're not just in charge of managing your project, but you're also having to take on the task of building a team and really making sure that your team is working and collaborating together. And so if you look at my happy team members, I've broken this out into two different sides. So we've got culture in the blue, and they're both blue. In the dark blue, we have culture, and in the light blue, we have processes. And so some of the culture pieces that I think are really important when I build my own team is having an open door policy, leaving room if someone needs to vent because they just need to go off the record for a moment, hosting happy hours, laughing with my team members. And then some of the light blue, the processes that I think through are things like having a daily scrum or a place where everyone's accountable to come and talk about their actions, having a retro so as a team we can reflect on how things went and improve as a group. And then also something that Levi and I like to do is making sure that we can give our team members stretch opportunities. So some things I think through are, if someone comes to me and they want to improve or they want to move up to that next level, what are the tasks that I'm doing that I can give to that person so that they can show improvement, or that they can just take ownership? That could be like leading a scrum or leading retro or a work stream even. And then I also like to include that it's important to have team members in your stakeholder meetings. A good and easy way to do this is just to have demos with your stakeholders every couple of weeks so that your team members can walk through the items that they're working on, and the stakeholder, they can understand how they're responding, they can get feedback, positive and negative, from the stakeholder, and really have ownership over what they're doing and why they're on this team. It's not your job to be a stopping point from the leadership and the team. It's your job to really like merge them together as a whole group.
So now that you have a better idea about how to manage some of your developers, the next step is to be thinking about how you can manage your stakeholders and their expectations. One of the best ways to do this is by scheduling a recurring status meeting with the stakeholders at Chipper, so that you can keep them informed on everything going on with the product being developed. So this is what we call a progress snapshot. You can see over in the progress overview, we have what we call a project status. We have green, on track, yellow, at risk, and red, behind. On track, meaning that we're beginning all of the work streams as planned, and we're completing them as planned. At risk means that there's something that might be preventing us from either starting or completing a deliverable by the expected timeline. And red is going to indicate that we are already behind, something has been missed, and we need to make some changes in order to resolve that issue. So first, in the project status, we want to give a high level. Specifically, you want to always speak to the project status. So if it's behind, tell them why it's behind. If it's at risk, tell them why it's at risk. If it's on track, tell them how on track it is and what on track looks like. That could be the number of story points compared to plan, or that could be the project percentage complete that would indicate, and comparing that to the expected percent complete. We also have the current sprint activities. So the idea is we want to list all of the things that your team is currently delivering and working on, what's been completed, and what the team still has active on their plate. Additionally, we also want to call out the next sprint activities where we list all of the things that we're planning to work on next. This should also give your stakeholders at Chipper an opportunity to change course and say, hey, maybe I don't want to start on browsing and filtering and searching products first. Maybe I want to do the checkout process first because I think that's more important. And you can always have a discussion and be willing to make those changes. As long as they're on the roadmap, that can be easy. So when they start adding scope, it starts to become a little bit more challenging. Finally, we have our discussion. So here we can go and track any decisions that need to be made. This isn't the best example, but one of them could be, who is the product owner? Who will be the product owner for our refinement sessions? Hopefully we have this answer by now, but it could absolutely be a relevant question if we don't already know. We also have the risks. We want to describe any risk that could delay the project if not mitigated. We also, if we have a risk, want to always include a mitigation option. So in this example, we could say something like, team has not received developer access to the inventory management APIs. Thus, we can't begin on that integration with their platform. The mitigation is, we could, if we don't receive access, delay the inventory integration to a future sprint and prioritize the checkout process if access is not received by the end of the week. You want to always provide a recommendation to make the decision easy for your stakeholders, because otherwise you're just expecting them to figure it all out and make that decision for you, which just isn't going to be efficient or effective. Next, we want to be talking about our issues. So these are things that will delay the project, right? So if you don't have access by this date and you're in the sprint, then maybe we're going to miss our deadline because we think it's going to take a full week and we only have a half week left. One example is that maybe we find out that as integrating with a custom inventory system, we find it doesn't provide the required data through its API. And so maybe the mitigation here, right, it's an issue, so the project is already going to be behind, is that we need to add another feature to our backlog to add the API endpoints in that system and expose the inventory quantities for a given ID to the new e-commerce platform that we're developing. One great way to manage the expectations of the stakeholders at Chipper is by using data-driven reporting, such as a Burnup Chart, to track actual progress against the planned progress. So over at the top, say our scope was 200 points, we would be tracking that at the beginning of our project all the way across to the end. And so the total scope is going to tell us how many story points the team has committed to complete by the end of the project. Any items that change scope, we should estimated items or new and removed scope items should also be captured and reported as part of the total overall scope, so we can see the historical change over time. Additionally, the planned progress is used as the cumulative planned velocity of the team each week. So Chipper has provided a tech lead and 2 developers, which results in a weekly capacity of about 20 story points to be added to the planned scope each week. So we can see that trend line, and that takes us to our planned target date, which is roughly 12/13. It'd be nice if we had a little bit of extra room just in case other things do change to make sure that we are hitting that 12/13 date. But for now, it's reasonable and could be made up. Next is the actual progress. So right now we're at the beginning of the project, so the actual progress is 0 points. But the idea is that we want to track the total number of story points completed each week. This should only track items that are completely finished and ready to be deployed to production. So they need to be implemented, tested. Everything needs to be done on that at the time of reporting. We don't want to be reporting any in-progress items or things that are almost ready, just because that doesn't really build trust and it's not a really accurate way to reflect completed scope. They should be ready to go for the end users. So now let's fast forward a little bit into the future to see what our Burnup Chart might look like around November 1st, which is a little under halfway into the project. So the idea is that we want to be updating this Burnup Chart every single week to track the current total scope, the actual progress, and the forecasted progress to ultimately determine the current forecasted completion date, which will indicate about how healthy the product development process is going. So we can see the blue line at the top is still our total scope, but it has changed over time. Sometimes the stakeholders, we might end up removing some items from the scope or some stories, and sometimes we might add some more back in because we have some extra capacity. But the idea is that we always want to make sure that this line is intersected by our forecasted progress. So let's take a look at the actual progress. We can see this is jittering slightly above or below the planned progress. And that is totally normal. Nobody expects that to be a fixed line, right? But the idea is, as long as you're pretty close to the plan, you should have enough flexibility to go and make that up. So currently, we are at 85 points. And so that means that our forecasted progress, which consists of the cumulative actual progress plus the planned velocity for each week, is taking us a bit over plan. So the forecasted completion date is going to be indicated by the intersection point between the total scope and the forecasted progress. Currently, the project is slightly ahead of plan by 5 points. Then that's just because we're 5 points above currently. And that brings our forecasted date to roughly 12/10, right? Just a little bit earlier than the plan, 12/13. And so it means our project is healthy, things are getting delivered on time, and ultimately we don't have any cause for concern. But this could change if we see this line drifting constantly more and more below plan. It means that we misestimated a lot of the scope items, and we just need to readjust our plan, maybe change the plan, and potentially have a hard conversation with the stakeholders telling them that we're not going to be able to complete everything based on our team's velocity. And you just always want to make sure that you have information to guide what led to this conversation in the first place, or what led to the situation happening, in case, just to ensure that they understand, and so everyone's on the same page and can move forward. Next, we want to make sure that we are reviewing the roadmap each week to ensure that the deliverables and the dependencies are beginning and ending according to the original timeline. Any divergence should be tracked as a risk and mitigated. And so we need to make sure that the team is executing according to the plan. So let's take a look at the deliverables. We can see we are in the week of 11/1. And so we should be nearly finished by the inventory management integration. And that should be ending right around the end of this current week. Additionally, we should be about halfway through the view products feature with that plan to end at the end of the next week. And we should also be getting ready to begin on the checkout process for the next week. And if we don't start on the checkout process at the beginning of next week, then that could potentially turn into a risk and something that we need to get ahead of, or potentially an issue depending on how delayed the start is. Next, let's take a look at some of the dependencies. So we also could be tracking our dependencies on our roadmap. And one reason that I feel this is super beneficial is because it starts to help us understand what the team needs to be getting ahead of as far as any refinement or UX activities. So if we take a look at our current sprint, in sprint 3, we are currently working on the view products and inventory management. However, the project leadership, the business analyst, the UX designer, and even the project lead should be working on finalizing the checkout process for UX and refinement, because we are planning to start that at the beginning of next week. Additionally, they should have already started on refining and developing the user experience mocks for the managed cart feature, because that is planned to begin in sprint 4. And so you can see how just viewing this roadmap every week forces the team to ask honest questions about where we are in the project. And if you keep following these sorts of methods every week, I promise you that this is going to be very helpful for tracking your overall project progress. And hopefully this turns you into turns it into something that can be very successful.
Awesome. So I just want to thank everyone for coming out and listening to our talk. I hope that you were able to pick up a tool or an idea that you either hadn't heard before or you just hadn't used in that way. Just remember that there really are no shortcuts if you're wanting to build a robust product plan. You can take shortcuts, don't get me wrong, but there's a chance that you're going to encounter issues in the future because of it. I have definitely experienced that. Also, even though we are planning out in this robust way, that doesn't mean we're not being agile or that we're doing a waterfall method. All of our ideas and tools are meant to be used in a way that is iterative. You know, like Levi talked through, if a stakeholder comes to you and says priorities changing, it's not the end of the world. Okay, what do we move back? Like, let's look at that feature list and see if we can pull anything up. Let's work together as a team. And that's the other point, is just continue to build that team environment with your product owners or your leadership and also your development team. I think it's really important that you're that point that can just build a great culture and hopefully inspire others to do the same. And last, if something blows up, don't panic. Just be transparent, admit if you've ever made a mistake, and just move on. Again, it's all pretty flexible. So have a great rest of the week. Thank you so much for listening. Okay, thank you so much everyone for watching the video. I can admit that it was a very weird experience for me having to sit and watch my own face on the screen. But I have a little bit of time now so that we can walk through a Q&A, or the Q&A that's added in. So the first question we have is, how do you balance process with keeping developer heads down on coding? And what ceremony should they be involved in? How do you shelter them to keep velocity up? So I think that's a really great question. And I've honestly had experiences on teams where I'm in meetings for 6 hours a day as a developer, and also teams where we're not meeting enough. And so I do think that it's something that you have to decide on as a group. Some of the notes that I wrote down were, I think scrums and working sessions, especially virtually, can be really helpful, just so that you know what tasks are being done. There's not any like duplicate work. And then you can unblock people in working sessions. Sprint planning is useful for the entire team so that you're able to understand what everyone is working on and what's going to happen coming up. Retros to hear, is this meeting cadence correct, or is the team vibing the way it should? Another note is that I like to split ownership. Some of my favorite teams that I've been on, we have had epics, or team leads, but epics are split up by individuals. So all of that research that's going on is a team effort, and it's not just one person who is doing all of the ticket creation and all of the research. And then last for that, I just encourage that you try to build a team that's open about what they can actually handle. If you're noticing late night PRs or pull requests or things like that, or emails sending out at midnight, bring that up as a way to help. Don't call it out like something's wrong, but just ask if the person's okay, and make sure that the team is prioritizing and splitting ownership in a good way. Okay. Oh, I think I clicked the button wrong. All right, so next question is, what are my thoughts on Kanban versus Agile manner? And since this is my opinionated guide with Levi, I would say that I like Agile a lot more. I'm currently on a project that's using Kanban, and I feel like we are not always aligned about what is going on or where the team should focus. And so I enjoy the Agile 2-week sprint, and before you start the 2 weeks, you're actually walking through everything that you're going to accomplish. I know that's not everyone's preference, but again, this is my opinion. And all right, is there a link to the slideshow? I don't have a shareable link currently, but if you ping me on LinkedIn, I'm gonna talk with my co-presenter, Levi, and figure out what we're comfortable sharing out and how we can get that to you. So my name is Morgan Monsingo on LinkedIn. Feel free to message me there. Okay, let's see. When do you recommend a more formal process like this? And is there a time for things to be a little less formal? This is pretty interesting. So it is, both Levi and I wrote this together, and we realized that we have different ways of how we like to build out projects. Levi is extremely organized, and I'm a little less so. And so some of the things that I focus on are the feature list, making sure that I'm aligned with what's expected from the stakeholders, and then also my developer health, and that they understand what's going on. And so sometimes I miss out on that project plan, or if it's a really short initiative, I won't focus on building out a roadmap. I have, again, in this last project, experienced some friction with my developers wanting a project plan, and then it's kind of strange to go in halfway through to build that out. And so I think, again, just talk with your team, figure out the way that y'all will work best. If they work really well, seeing that burn down chart and understanding like if they're on track, then maybe prioritize that higher than you would all of the assumptions in a feature list. I see a question here about a Scrum band type of a team. What are your thoughts? I'm imagining that's a mix between the two, but I haven't actually done that. And so I will definitely be Googling this afterwards. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay, how do you estimate your team's velocity if there are new developers on your team? Is it trial and error for a while? So I do work in a consulting experience, and so we have to estimate our velocity every time we move projects, which is pretty interesting because everyone is so different with how they work. And it is trial and error. I think that there is some research done about how it takes like 6 sprints or something like that to actually find the true velocity of a team. And so you just need to be flexible. I would take who is my highest performer and who is my like lowest velocity performer, and then probably find an average between the two for anyone new being brought onto my team. And that's how I would estimate at first. And then if it turns out that that was wrong, just be flexible the next week and be understanding that. I just think that, you know, like your estimates are not like end all be all. If you miss some points, that's fine. Just be open and understanding, and then next week do better, or next sprint do better. Okay, I do see a question here about keeping developers happy and then using the iron triangle of cost, quality, and scope. Any tips on how to have that conversation when stakeholders are pushing for overtime? So when Levi and I were writing this out, we actually had a really long conversation about overtime, because I was mentioning, you know, like technically we could have developers work over, and he was like, we're not adding that to the presentation. We're not encouraging people to work overtime at all. And so that's just a hard line that he draws as a leader, is he would rather work the overtime instead of having to make anyone else work it. So I respect that a lot. I think that the conversation you need to have with stakeholders is overtime will cause burnout eventually, and it's not healthy for a team to constantly work in overtime. If there are small pushes occasionally, maybe that's understandable, but everyone on the team needs to be on the same page. And you as a leader, even if you're not doing development, I think you need to be on those overtime calls. It is a team effort, and you need to be there to support those who might be working. And then also some things that have happened in the past that I've really appreciated is when we're working overtime, I've had project directors send money for dinner. And just, it's little things like that that let your team know that you are still there for them, even though it's in a rough period. Okay, so can you explain how and when you work with the tech lead on fleshing out the features and breaking them down into stories? Some of our developers are new, and so some stories sometimes are super small and more like subtasks. Yeah, so I guess when I'm working with a tech lead on breaking down the features, so I've been on a couple of different projects, and so I've had tech leads who are really detail oriented, and so they'll take epics and every feature where they'll almost go in and solve the problem before you actually get to the ticket. And I've had other tech leads who are more higher level, so they want their developers to go in and solve the problems for themselves. And so the way that I usually do is kind of work with the developers. If we have something that they're unable to estimate, then we need to add more detail into this ticket. And so the tech lead and I may go in together and actually work through that. Like, hey, these 5 tickets don't have enough detail. No one can pick this up. There's 7 open questions. Or, you know, if there's too much detail, then calling the tech lead and just saying, hey, I think that we need to leave some more room for flexibility for our developers. I find it like very much a conversation and an iterative process. And then I know that you said that sometimes your developers are new, and so those stories are super small. And so I've seen this also with like developers are new to a context, so maybe it's a different language. And I think it's okay to have small stories that are subtasks that are pointed less, as long as it's helping them get comfortable with the code base and with what they're doing. I hope that answers question. Ooh, main topics you cover in a sprint retro. I had a lead or a PM working with me who created a sprint board or a retro board, sorry, that was, what's going well, what's going poorly, what can change. And then they actually added a new column in that was, how are you feeling? And so I will always add that column in to every retro that I do here on out, because I think that's where we get the meat of the conversation. So some of the topics I want to know are you having meeting fatigue, especially virtually? I know if I have another coffee chat added to my calendar, I think I might cry a little bit. But so are you in meeting fatigue? And then also, do you feel like you understand the direction of the project? Are the tickets clear enough? And then this is where I sometimes will call out some friction I've seen. And so like, how is communication between myself and the team? How's communication between stakeholders in the team? That's where I see a lot of the friction. That sometimes I'll plant that in there as, if I'm having these problems, then someone else probably is as well. But again, I just really love the how are you feeling, because I know that there have been times where I've said things like, I feel like I've been hit by a bus this sprint. And then people are like, wait, what's going on? And it gives it gives an opportunity for a conversation, and then people can raise their hands with me like, yeah, I also have been in too many meetings, or we just are not vibing well as a group. Okay, what are some of the best practices or advice for a product manager and product owner relationship from the perspective of being a PM? That is a great question. Some of the things that I have done to make sure that that relationship is really strong is to just loop them in to conversations that I'm having. One of my favorite product owners, he very close friend as well now, and I loved working on his team because he would give me tasks to do, like, hey, I want you to investigate this large initiative that we want to do, and then I would get to go lead all of those meetings without him. But then I would come back and report, like, I've talked to the stakeholder, this is what I'm hearing, here are some of the emails or the information. And so I see it as like a good relationship where product owner is defining the vision, and then your product managers can go out and actually execute and do all the research so that they don't have to stay in the meetings themselves. I think that if a product owner was micromanaging too much, they probably would find that they had too much on their plate. And so sometimes it's that product manager's job to just take that off for them. Okay, and then what are your recommendations for balancing spike bug tickets versus burning feature tickets requested from the business? So that is a great question. I've been on teams where they will say, we are always going to put 10% of the work that we do in a sprint towards bugs or towards cleanup of code. I think that it's important to find out, like, are your spikes, investigation, or bug tickets going to enable work in the future, or are they small tasks? Kind of like I was talking about, like those tasks where, okay, maybe this is the wrong color on a button, and that's technically a bug, but does anyone notice it? And is it inhibiting future development? And so prioritizing everything is really important. If your spike is for the next sprint, it might be important to bring one or two into the current sprint so that you have work to do in the future. You don't want to get to a point where there's just nothing going on. And then how do you set expectations with stakeholders? I think being very open about, like, the need for investigation or spikes, tell them what it's enabling for them. If the stakeholders are going to get $50,000 more with the feature, but you don't know how to implement it yet, that sounds really nice to them. So they want you to figure out how to actually implement that feature. And then this will be the last question. Since you mentioned having a product owner and a PM, what is your recommendation if you only have one product manager for a milestone and no other product roles? My recommendation is twofold. So it is your job to have a lot on your plate, and that sometimes is really hard, but raise your hand if there are things that your tech team or the rest of your team can do. When I have people who are really interested in stepping up, sometimes I'll give them small tasks like leading Scrum or leading Retro, and it's wild how small of a thing that is to take off your plate, or it seems like you're just breathing, but it just gives you a couple more minutes to think about what's going on outside of those small meetings. And so if there are epics that you need help with someone going out and doing research, see who's interested in that mix of tech and product side, because I get the feeling there probably is someone who is ready to be at that next level and is looking for more responsibility as well. Okay, so we're at time. I'm a little bit over. Thank you so much for sitting in and listening, and feel free to add myself or Levi Fuller on LinkedIn and ask any other questions there.